There's a test that takes 10 seconds, requires no equipment, no lab, no blood draw, and according to a growing body of research, predicts how long you're likely to live more accurately than most of the health metrics doctors routinely check. It's not your blood pressure. It's not your cholesterol. It's not even your resting heart rate. It's your grip strength, and specifically, how quickly and how well you can do a handful of simple physical tasks that most of us haven't thought about since we were children. Standing up from the floor without using your hands, balancing on one leg, squeezing a device as hard as you can for a few seconds. I want to walk you through exactly what the science says about why these simple tests turned out to be such powerful predictors. What's actually happening inside your body that makes them so informative, and more importantly, exactly what you can do starting today if your own results aren't where you'd want them to be. Let's start with the study that really put this on the map, because I think seeing the actual data matters more than simply being told a conclusion. A landmark analysis published in the Lancet, part of a large international research effort called the PURE study, followed adults across 17 countries and measured grip strength using a simple handheld device called a dynamometer, alongside standard cardiovascular risk factors like blood pressure and cholesterol. What they found was that grip strength was more strongly associated with all-cause mortality and with cardiovascular mortality specifically than systolic blood pressure was citation, the Lancet, 2015, the PURE study on grip strength and mortality across multiple countries. Let that sit with you for a second, because this is a genuinely remarkable finding. A 10-second squeeze test outperformed one of the most heavily monitored, heavily treated risk factors in all of cardiovascular medicine as a predictor of who was going to die and who wasn't. This wasn't a one-off either. Multiple subsequent studies and meta-analyses have replicated this general pattern, finding that grip strength is consistently and independently associated with lower all-cause mortality, even after statistically controlling for cardiovascular fitness, body weight, and other established risk factors. Citation. This pattern has been confirmed across multiple meta-analyses published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine examining muscular strength and mortality risk. And more recently, a study published in JAMA Network Open in early 2026 followed over 5,000 women for more than 8 years and found that muscular strength independently predicted who lived and who didn't, even after accounting for age, existing health conditions, and standard risk factors. Citation, JAMA Network Open, 2026, muscular strength and long-term mortality outcomes in women. This tells us something important, that strength isn't simply acting as a proxy for general fitness or a healthy lifestyle. It appears to be contributing something of its own to your risk of dying, independent of how good your cardiovascular system is at delivering oxygen to your tissues, and independent of how careful you are about your diet and your cholesterol numbers. So the first question worth asking is, why would something as simple as a hand squeeze carry this kind of independent predictive power? And I think the answer comes down to what grip strength actually represents physiologically. It turns out grip strength isn't really just about your hands at all. It functions as a remarkably efficient window into your overall muscular and physiological health, a kind of biological shorthand that reflects processes happening throughout your entire body. Let's talk about sarcopenia, the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength, because this is really the central biological process underlying everything we're discussing today. Beginning somewhere around the age of 30, adults who are not engaging in resistance training typically lose somewhere between 3 and 8% of their muscle mass per decade. And this rate of loss tends to accelerate considerably after the age of 60. Citation, Journal of the American Medical Directors Association, Sarcopenia Prevalence and Progression Research. Grip strength happens to be one of the most sensitive, easily measurable indicators of this broader process because hand and forearm muscle function tends to decline in close correlation with overall skeletal muscle mass and strength throughout the body, meaning a simple hand squeeze gives researchers, and potentially you, a remarkably efficient proxy for something that would otherwise require expensive imaging or complex laboratory testing to measure directly. Citation, this correlation between grip strength specifically and total body muscle mass and strength has been established across multiple studies in geriatric and sports medicine literature, including validation research published in Age and Aging. This is not a minor cosmetic change we're discussing. Skeletal muscle is not just the tissue that lets you lift things. It functions as the body's largest reservoir of amino acids, plays a central role in glucose disposal and metabolic health, and is deeply intertwined with your ability to maintain balance, prevent falls, and recover from illness or injury without a catastrophic permanent decline in function. This last point about recovering from illness deserves particular attention because it connects directly to why a simple strength measurement predicts mortality so strongly. When an older adult with low muscle mass and strength experiences an acute illness, a hospitalization, a bout of pneumonia, a hip fracture, they have a much smaller physiological reserve to draw on during that period of forced inactivity and metabolic stress. Muscle tissue gets broken down rapidly during acute illness and bed rest, and someone who entered that illness with already low muscle reserves can lose a devastating proportion of their remaining functional strength in a matter of days, sometimes never fully recovering it. Citation, Critical Care Medicine and Journals of Gerontology, Muscle Loss During Acute Illness and Hospitalization Research. Some research on this specific phenomenon has found that even a period as short as 10 days of complete bed rest can produce meaningful, measurable declines in leg muscle strength and mass in older adults, declines that would ordinarily take years to accumulate through age-related decline alone. Citation, this accelerated muscle loss during short-term bed rest and immobilization has been documented in metabolic ward studies published in journals including the American Journal of Physiology. Now let's get into the second major test that's been getting attention in this same body of research, the sitting rising test. This one is exactly what it sounds like. You lower yourself from a standing position all the way down to sitting on the floor, and then stand back up using as little support from your hands, knees, or the furniture around you as possible. Researchers score this on a simple scale, starting at 10 points and subtracting a point each time you need to use a hand, a knee, or lose your balance along the way. A study following adults for over 6 years found that people who scored low on this test, indicating they needed significant support to get up and down from the floor, had a mortality risk several times higher than those who could complete the test using little to no support. Citation, this sitting rising test and mortality research has been published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology and represents one of the more extensively studied simple physical assessments in this space. What makes this test so informative is that it simultaneously captures several different physical qualities at once: muscular strength, particularly in the legs and core, flexibility, balance, and coordination, all in a single brief movement, which likely explains why it correlates so strongly with broader physiological resilience and, by extension, with mortality risk. I want to spend some time on the balance piece of this specifically, because I think it's genuinely underappreciated how much information a simple balance test can convey. Single leg standing balance, meaning how long you can balance on one leg with your eyes open, has also been studied extensively as a predictor of health outcomes in older adults. One notable study found that adults over 50 who were unable to balance on one leg for at least 10 seconds had a significantly higher risk of death over the following decade compared to those who could, even after adjusting for age, sex, and various underlying health conditions. Citation, British Journal of Sports Medicine, 2022, Single Leg Balance Test and 10-Year Mortality Risk Research. This finding got an enormous amount of attention when it was published, and for good reason. The effect size was genuinely striking. Individuals who failed the 10-second balance test had roughly double the risk of death during the follow-up period compared to those who passed. Citation, this specific magnitude of increased mortality risk associated with failing the 10-second single-leg balance test was reported in the original British Journal of Sports Medicine study and has been widely cited in subsequent research and clinical discussion of balance assessment. Balance, much like grip strength and the sitting rising test, isn't really about the specific skill being tested in isolation. It's a window into something much broader. Maintaining balance requires the coordinated function of your vestibular system in the inner ear, your visual system, proprioception, meaning your body's sense of where its limbs are in space, and the rapid coordinated firing of muscles throughout your legs, hips, and core to make constant micro adjustments that keep you upright. Citation: this integrated multi-system nature of balance control is well established in neurophysiology and motor control literature. When any one of these systems declines, whether from muscle weakness, nerve conduction changes, inner ear dysfunction, or reduced processing speed in the brain regions coordinating this information, balance tends to be one of the first things to suffer, which is part of why it functions as such a sensitive early indicator of broader physiological decline, often becoming measurably impaired well before someone notices meaningful weakness or other symptoms in daily life. Let's talk now about why this matters so directly for actual survival, beyond simply being a marker that correlates with other things. Falls are the leading cause of both fatal and non-fatal injuries among older adults, and the risk of falling increases considerably with declining balance and lower body strength. Citation: this relationship between balance, lower body strength, and fall risk in older adults is well established in geriatric medicine and injury prevention literature, including data published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on fall-related injury and mortality in older populations. And we touched on this in a previous video, but it bears repeating here specifically. Hip fractures in elderly adults carry remarkably elevated one-year mortality rates, often cited in the range of 20 to 30% depending on the population studied. Citation: this elevated mortality following hip fracture in older adults is well documented across orthopedic and geriatric medicine literature. It's frequently not the fracture itself that kills people. It's the cascade that follows, the loss of mobility, the muscle wasting during recovery, the increased vulnerability to subsequent falls, infections, and complications. This means that balance and strength aren't simply markers correlated with survival through some indirect statistical relationship. They're directly, mechanistically involved in one of the most common pathways towards serious injury and death in older populations. A test that predicts your balance and strength is, in a very real sense, predicting your risk of the specific event most likely to trigger this cascade in the first place. I want to bring in the metabolic piece of this puzzle too, because I think it's genuinely surprising how far the implications of a simple strength test extend beyond the muscles being directly tested. Skeletal muscle is the primary site of glucose disposal in the body, meaning it's the tissue most responsible for clearing glucose from your bloodstream after a meal, largely through a transporter called GLUT4 that gets upregulated with resistance training and muscle contraction. Citation: Journal of Applied Physiology, Skeletal Muscle Glucose Uptake Research. Individuals with lower muscle mass and strength have been shown to have a reduced capacity for this glucose disposal, contributing to insulin resistance. And observational research has found associations between low muscle mass and a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, independent of overall body fat percentage. Citation: Diabetes Care, Muscle Mass, and Insulin Sensitivity Research. Muscle also plays a significant role in immune function during periods of acute stress or illness. Amino acids released from skeletal muscle serve as a critical resource for immune cell proliferation and for the synthesis of proteins needed for wound healing and infection response. Citation: this relationship between skeletal muscle reserves and immune resilience during illness is discussed in research on sarcopenia and clinical outcomes in critically ill and hospitalized populations. So when a simple grip test or sitting rising test picks up on low strength, what it's actually flagging indirectly is a whole cascade of downstream vulnerabilities, metabolic, immunological, and structural, that a hand squeeze on its own would never seem capable of revealing. I also want to address the cognitive dimension of this because it genuinely surprised me the first time I came across it in the literature. Several longitudinal studies have found associations between grip strength specifically and cognitive outcomes, including reduced risk of cognitive decline and dementia over follow-up periods extending many years. Citation: this relationship has been examined in several large cohort studies published in journals, including the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. The proposed mechanisms here are still being actively researched, but likely include several overlapping pathways: resistance training and muscular activity's effects on cerebral blood flow, its role in reducing systemic inflammation, which has been increasingly implicated in cognitive decline, and its effects on brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein involved in neuroplasticity, citation, frontiers in aging, neuroscience, resistance training, and cognitive health mechanisms research. This doesn't mean grip strength is a guaranteed prevention strategy against dementia, or that a weak grip in isolation means cognitive decline is inevitable. The evidence at this stage represents strong, consistent associations rather than definitively proven causal mechanisms. But it does suggest that whatever these simple physical tests are actually measuring extends into domains that most people would never intuitively connect to a hand squeeze or a balance check. If you want to actually go deep on the full research behind everything I'm covering in this video and get a complete structured breakdown of exactly how to test yourself properly and build a program to improve each of these specific markers, I put together a couple of ebooks that walk through this in a lot more detail. They're linked down in the description below. And honestly, if this is a topic you want to actually act on rather than just watch and forget, I genuinely encourage you to go check them out. Now let's get into how you can actually test yourself at home, because I think this is where this entire conversation becomes genuinely useful rather than just interesting. For grip strength specifically, the gold standard measurement uses a handheld dynamometer, a relatively inexpensive device that's become increasingly accessible for home use, and research has established reasonably clear reference ranges by age and sex that you can compare your own results against citation. These normative grip strength reference values by age and sex have been published in studies, including those in the journal Hand Therapy, establishing population norms for dynamometer testing. If you don't have access to a dynamometer, a rough, less precise proxy is simply paying attention to functional grip tasks in daily life, whether you're able to comfortably open jars, carry heavy grocery bags for a sustained distance, or hang from a bar for a meaningful duration. Though I want to be clear that these functional proxies are considerably less precise than an actual dynamometer measurement. And if this is something you're genuinely concerned about, getting an actual measurement, either through a home device or during a routine physical therapy or physician visit, is worth doing rather than relying purely on subjective functional assessment. For the sitting rising test, you don't need any equipment at all. Find a bare patch of floor and lower yourself down to a full seated position, then stand back up, trying to use as little support from your hands, arms, or knees as possible, and pay attention to whether you lose your balance along the way. If you're genuinely unable to complete this without substantial support from furniture or another person, or if attempting it feels risky given your current balance and mobility, that's important information in itself, and it's worth discussing with a physician or physical therapist rather than pushing through it alone, particularly if you have any underlying joint or balance conditions that might make this specific test inadvisable without proper supervision. For the single leg balance test, stand near something sturdy you can grab if needed for safety, lift one foot slightly off the ground, and see how long you can hold that position with your eyes open before needing to touch down or grab support. The research benchmark that's received the most attention specifically evaluated whether people could sustain this for 10 seconds, so that's a reasonable target to test yourself against, though I'd encourage doing this near a wall or sturdy chair specifically for safety, particularly if you're not confident in your current balance. Since the point of this exercise is information gathering, not risking an actual fall in the process of testing for your fall risk, I want to be honest about something important here, which is what these test results actually mean, and don't mean for you individually. These are population-level associations drawn from large groups of people followed over years or decades. And a single test result, whether it's impressive or concerning, is not a definitive individual prognosis. Plenty of people with below average grip strength or balance at a given point in time go on to improve those specific measures substantially. And the research on this improvement potential is genuinely one of the more encouraging parts of this entire conversation, which I want to spend real time on now. Let's talk about what the research says about actually improving these specific markers, because I think this is ultimately the most important part of this video. Grip strength itself responds to targeted training, but more importantly, it responds to the same resistance training that builds overall muscular strength throughout your body. Since grip strength functions largely as an indicator of your broader strength status rather than a completely isolated skill. Studies have found that structured resistance training programs, particularly those involving compound multi-joint movements like deadlifts, rows, and various pulling and carrying exercises, produce meaningful improvements in grip strength as a downstream benefit. Even when grip itself isn't the primary training focus, citation, this relationship between general resistance training and improved grip strength outcomes has been examined in exercise science research published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. If you want to target grip specifically and more directly, exercises like farmer's carries, where you simply walk while holding heavy weights at your sides for time or distance, dead hangs from a pull-up bar, and direct grip training using hand grippers or thick-handled implements have all been shown to produce meaningful improvements in grip strength, specifically citation. These direct grip training modalities and their effects on grip strength have been studied in strength and conditioning research, published in various sports science journals. For the sitting rising test specifically, improvement comes primarily from a combination of lower body strength, hip and ankle flexibility, and practicing the specific movement pattern itself, since coordination and movement familiarity genuinely matter for a test like this beyond pure strength alone. Squatting movements, whether using body weight alone or with added resistance, lunges, and hip mobility work targeting the hip flexors and hamstrings specifically. Since limited hip and ankle mobility is a common limiting factor preventing people from performing this movement smoothly, have all been shown to improve performance on functional movement assessments similar to the sitting rising test citation. This relationship between lower body strength and mobility training and functional movement test performance has been examined in geriatric exercise science research published in journals, including the Journals of Gerontology. Balance training deserves particular attention here because the research on its trainability is genuinely encouraging, even for people who currently struggle considerably with a single leg standing test. Structured balance training programs, which can be as simple as practicing single leg standing for progressively longer durations, or as involved as formal Tai Chi or yoga-based balance programs, have been shown across multiple randomized controlled trials to meaningfully improve balance performance and, critically, to reduce actual fall incidence in older adults. Citation: this fall reduction effect of structured balance training has been demonstrated across a substantial body of randomized trial evidence, summarized in systematic reviews published in the Cochrane Database of Systematic Reviews. This is a genuinely high confidence, well-replicated finding, and it means that even if your current single leg balance time is well below the 10-second benchmark we discussed earlier, this is a meaningfully trainable quality, not a fixed trait you're simply stuck with as you age. Practicing standing on one leg for even a few minutes total per day, gradually progressing toward more challenging variations like closing your eyes or standing on an unstable surface, once basic single leg standing becomes comfortable, can produce measurable improvement over a period of weeks to months. Citation: this general dose response pattern for balance training improvement has been described in exercise science literature on balance and postural control training. I also want to address power specifically here because I think this adds an important layer of nuance to how you should think about training for these specific outcomes, particularly if you're older or specifically concerned about fall risk. Skeletal muscle contains different fiber types, broadly categorized as type 1, slow twitch, fatigue-resistant fibers, and type 2, fast twitch, more powerful fibers recruited for strength and power movements. Research has consistently found that age-related muscle loss disproportionately affects type 2 fast twitch fibers, with some studies finding considerably greater atrophy and even selective loss of these fibers compared to type 1 fibers as we age. Citation: Journal of Applied Physiology and Experimental Gerontology. Age-related muscle fiber type changes research. This selective loss is directly relevant to functional capacity, because these are precisely the fibers responsible for generating the rapid, forceful contractions needed to catch yourself during a stumble, to rise quickly from a fall, or to generate the burst of force needed to avoid a dangerous situation in the first place. Some research has found that measures of muscular power, meaning how quickly force can be generated, are even more strongly associated with fall risk and functional decline in older adults than measures of maximal strength alone. Citation, Journals of Gerontology, Muscle Power versus Strength, and Functional Outcomes in Aging Research. This means that training approaches incorporating some element of intentional speed, moving the concentric lifting phase of an exercise explosively, even when using a moderate load rather than exclusively slow, controlled repetitions specifically target this fast twitch capacity that's disproportionately lost with age and disproportionately important for the exact scenarios these simple tests are indirectly assessing. Citation, this power-focused training approach for older adults is supported by research published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise on power training interventions in aging populations. Let me talk now about how frequently and how much of this kind of training is actually needed to move the needle, because I don't want anyone watching this to think they need to overhaul their entire life to see meaningful improvement in these markers. Research on minimum effective doses for resistance training and functional outcomes has found that even relatively modest amounts of structured training are associated with substantial benefit. One large study found that adults who engaged in muscle strengthening activity for as little as 1 to 2 sessions per week had significantly lower all-cause mortality compared to those who did no resistance training at all. Citation, British Journal of Sports Medicine, Resistance Training Frequency and Mortality Risk, meta-analysis. Similarly, balanced training research has generally found meaningful improvement with programs involving as little as a total of 30 to 60 minutes of dedicated balance practice weekly, spread across multiple shorter sessions. Citation, this general dose response finding for balanced training frequency has been described in fall prevention exercise research published in Systematic Reviews on Balanced Training Interventions. This means the barrier to entry for meaningfully improving your own results on these specific tests is genuinely lower than most people assume. This isn't a matter of needing hours of daily training. It's a matter of consistent, appropriately targeted effort a few times per week. I want to walk through what a genuinely practical, evidence-based weekly approach to improving all three of these markers together might actually look like, since I think this is more useful than discussing each in complete isolation. A resistance training routine performed 2 to 3 times weekly, built around compound movements, squats, or sit-to-stand variations for lower body strength directly relevant to the sitting-rising test, deadlifts, rows, or farmer's carries for grip strength and overall pulling strength, and presses for upper body pushing strength, provides a strong foundation that touches on nearly all of these markers simultaneously, since they're all downstream expressions of overall muscular strength and function to a considerable degree. Layered on top of this dedicated balance practice, even something as simple as standing on one leg while brushing your teeth or waiting for coffee to brew, accumulated in small doses throughout the day, alongside more formal balance training a few times weekly if you have access to a structured class like Tai Chi or a balance-focused physical therapy program, addresses the balance-specific component that general resistance training alone doesn't fully capture. And incorporating some element of intentional speed and power into your lower body training, even something as simple as standing up from a chair as quickly as you comfortably can for a set of repetitions, rather than always moving slowly and deliberately, helps specifically target the fast twitch fiber capacity that both fall prevention and the power-related research we discussed depend on. I want to spend a bit more time now on protein intake specifically, since building and maintaining the muscle mass and strength underlying all of these markers requires adequate raw material for repair, and this becomes particularly important given a phenomenon called anabolic resistance, where older muscle tissue requires a comparatively larger protein stimulus to trigger the same magnitude of muscle protein synthesis response that younger muscle would produce from a smaller stimulus. Citation, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Aging and Anabolic Resistance Research. Research generally suggests that adults, particularly those over 50, benefit from protein intakes toward the higher end of general population recommendations, often cited in the range of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight daily, distributed across multiple meals throughout the day rather than concentrated in a single meal, to maximize the muscle protein synthesis stimulating effect at each eating occasion, citation. This protein distribution and total intake recommendation for older adults is discussed in position papers published by the International Society of Sports Nutrition and related aging and nutrition research. This isn't a call to dramatically restructure your entire diet, but it's worth recognizing that the training stimulus, we've spent so much of this conversation discussing, needs adequate nutritional support to actually translate into improved test results over time. Let me now address something that I think deserves genuine, direct attention, which is the honest limitations of using these simple tests as the entirety of your health assessment, because I don't want this video to give the impression that a home balance check and a hand squeeze replace actual medical evaluation. These tests are genuinely valuable as accessible, low-cost screening tools that can flag meaningful risk and motivate action. And the research supporting their predictive value is real and substantial, but they're population-level statistical associations, not diagnostic tools in the clinical sense. And they don't account for individual medical history, existing conditions, medications that might affect balance or strength, or other factors that a proper medical evaluation would consider. If your results on any of these tests are notably poor, particularly if you're experiencing sudden or rapid decline in strength or balance, rather than a gradual pattern consistent with normal aging, that's a signal worth bringing to a physician for proper evaluation, rather than something to address purely through self-directed training without ruling out other underlying causes that might require different treatment entirely. Citation needed for specific clinical guidance on when self-directed exercise is appropriate versus when a sudden change in strength or balance warrants urgent medical evaluation, since this depends considerably on the specific clinical presentation and individual circumstances involved, which is exactly the kind of judgment that requires an actual physician's assessment rather than general population-level research. I also want to address something about the specific numbers and cutoffs used in this research, because I think precision matters here, and I don't want to leave you with an oversimplified sense of exactly how these thresholds were established. The 10-second single-leg balance benchmark, for instance, was specifically chosen in the original research as a reasonably achievable target for a broad population of middle-aged and older adults, not because there's something magically protective about exactly 10 seconds as opposed to 9 or 11, but because it represented a meaningful, measurable threshold that reliably separated people into groups with meaningfully different mortality outcomes in that particular study, population, citation. This methodological basis for the specific 10-second threshold is discussed in the original British Journal of Sports Medicine research and subsequent commentary on the study's methodology. Similarly, grip strength reference ranges and the sitting rising test 10-point scoring system represent researchers' efforts to create standardized, reproducible measurements from what are ultimately continuous physical qualities, strength, balance, mobility, that don't have a single hard cutoff separating healthy from unhealthy in any absolute biological sense. I mention this because I think it's honest and useful to understand that these are research tools designed to capture meaningful population-level patterns rather than precise individual diagnostic thresholds with some kind of magical significance attached to the exact number of seconds or points involved. I want to bring up something else that I think adds valuable context here, which is how these various simple tests relate to each other and whether someone doing poorly on one but well on another should be particularly concerned. Research examining multiple physical performance measures simultaneously has generally found that they're correlated with each other, meaning someone with strong grip strength tends, on average, to also perform reasonably well on balance and functional mobility tests, since they're all downstream reflections of overall muscular and neurological health to some degree. But the correlation isn't perfect, and it's entirely possible and not uncommon for someone to have notably better grip strength than balance, or vice versa, reflecting somewhat different underlying physiological systems and potentially different specific training needs, citation. This pattern of moderate but imperfect correlation between different physical performance measures has been examined in geriatric assessment research published in journals, including the journals of gerontology. This is actually a useful piece of practical information because it suggests that testing yourself across multiple of these simple measures, rather than relying on just one, gives you a considerably more complete picture of where your specific strengths and vulnerabilities currently lie, which in turn can help you prioritize your training time toward whichever specific quality, strength, balance, mobility appears to need the most attention in your particular case, rather than assuming a single test result tells the complete story. Let me also touch on something that I think matters for how you should interpret improvement over time, since this is ultimately what you actually care about if you decide to act on any of this. Research tracking changes in these functional measures over time, rather than single snapshot assessments, has found that meaningful improvement is achievable across a fairly broad age range, including in adults well into their 70s and 80s, provided appropriate progressive training is applied consistently. Citation, this trainability of strength, balance, and functional capacity, even at older ages, has been demonstrated across numerous randomized controlled trials in geriatric exercise science, including research published in the journals of gerontology and age and aging. This is genuinely important context because I think there's a common, understandable assumption that decline in these areas past a certain age is simply an inevitable, unstoppable process. And while some degree of age-related decline is indeed a normal part of aging that can't be entirely prevented, the research is quite clear that the rate and severity of that decline is substantially modifiable through consistent, appropriately structured training, meaning the gap between someone who trains these qualities deliberately and someone who doesn't tends to widen considerably over the years, even though both individuals are aging at the same chronological rate. If any of this is resonating with you and you want a complete, structured plan for testing yourself properly across all of these markers and then building a program specifically designed to improve whatever areas your own results suggest need the most attention, that's exactly the kind of practical, step-by-step material I put together in the ebooks linked in the description below. I built them because a video like this can walk you through the reasoning and the general approach, but actually implementing a proper testing and training protocol benefits enormously from having a structured reference you can come back to and follow consistently. So if you want to go deeper than what I can cover here in a single video, that's genuinely the best next step, and I'd really encourage you to check it out. I want to spend some time now addressing a natural question that I think a lot of people watching this are probably wondering about, which is how these simple physical tests compare to more sophisticated, technology-driven health assessments that have become increasingly popular. Things like continuous glucose monitors, wearable devices estimating cardiorespiratory fitness, or comprehensive blood panels. I don't think this is really an either-or question. And I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting these simple physical tests should replace more comprehensive health monitoring for anyone who has access to it and finds it valuable. What I think is genuinely notable, and part of why this research has resonated so strongly with people, is that these simple tests capture something that a lot of more sophisticated, expensive monitoring technology doesn't directly measure at all: functional physical capacity, the literal ability of your body to do the physical tasks that determine independence and resilience in daily life. A comprehensive blood panel can tell you a great deal about your metabolic and cardiovascular risk factors, but it won't tell you whether you can actually get up off the floor without help or whether your balance is good enough to avoid a dangerous fall. And the research we've covered throughout this video suggests these functional capacities carry substantial, independent predictive weight of their own beyond what traditional biomarkers alone would capture. I also want to address something about the accessibility and equity angle of this research, because I think it's genuinely one of the more compelling aspects of this entire body of work. Advanced health monitoring technology, comprehensive genetic testing, continuous glucose monitors, high-end wearable devices, and frequent comprehensive blood panels all require meaningful financial resources and access that a substantial portion of the global population simply doesn't have available to them. The tests we've discussed throughout this video, grip strength using an inexpensive dynamometer, the sitting rising test, single leg balance, require essentially no equipment, no specialized facility, and no ongoing cost. And yet the research suggests they carry predictive power that rivals or exceeds many of these more expensive technology-dependent approaches. This is part of why I find this specific body of research genuinely exciting. Beyond just its scientific interest, it represents meaningful, actionable health information that's available to essentially anyone, anywhere, regardless of their access to expensive healthcare technology or specialized medical facilities. Let me bring this entire conversation together now into a clear, practical set of takeaways. Simple physical tests, grip strength, the sitting rising test, and single leg balance have each been independently shown in substantial bodies of research to predict mortality risk, in some cases as strongly or more strongly than traditional heavily monitored risk factors like blood pressure. This predictive power isn't magical or mysterious. It reflects the fact that these simple tests capture broader, clinically meaningful information about muscular strength, metabolic health, immune resilience, balance, and even cognitive health, all condensed into a brief, accessible physical assessment that requires no specialized equipment or expensive testing. Critically, and this is the piece I most want you to walk away with, these are not fixed, unchangeable traits that simply decline inevitably as you age. They are genuinely trainable qualities with substantial research demonstrating meaningful improvement achievable through consistent, appropriately structured resistance training, balance practice, and power-focused training, even well into older age. If you test yourself on any of these measures and find your results aren't where you'd like them to be, that's genuinely encouraging information rather than discouraging news, because it identifies a specific, actionable target that the research clearly shows can be meaningfully improved with consistent effort over a period of weeks to months, not years or decades. The honest, evidence-based path forward here is straightforward, even if it isn't flashy or complicated. Test yourself across these simple measures to understand where you currently stand. Build a resistance training routine performed 2 to 3 times weekly, incorporating compound movements that build overall strength relevant to grip, lower body power, and functional mobility together. Add dedicated balance practice, even in small, frequent doses throughout your day, since this is a distinctly trainable quality that general strength training alone doesn't fully address. Incorporate some element of intentional speed and power into your training, not just slow, controlled strength work, since fast twitch fiber capacity specifically predicts fall risk and functional resilience in ways that maximal strength alone doesn't fully capture. Support all of this with adequate protein intake distributed across your day. And retest yourself periodically, not as a source of anxiety, but as genuine, objective feedback on whether your training is actually producing the improvement the research suggests is achievable. If there's one thing I want you to take away from everything we've covered today, it's this. The tests we've discussed in this video take, collectively, less than a minute to perform, require no equipment beyond perhaps an inexpensive hand dynamometer, and yet the research suggests they carry genuine, substantial information about your long-term health and longevity, information that's often more directly actionable than a lot of the more complex, expensive health metrics that get far more attention in mainstream health conversations. Go test yourself. If the results are good, that's genuinely valuable confirmation that whatever you're currently doing is working. And if the results reveal a specific weakness in your grip, your legs, your balance, that's not a life sentence. It's a clear, specific, and genuinely achievable target for exactly where your training time should be going starting this week. Before we wrap up, if you want the complete structured version of this exact testing protocols you can follow at home, reference ranges to compare your own results against by age and sex, and a full progressive training program specifically designed to improve each of these markers based on where your own results land. All of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it this far into the video, you clearly care about actually doing something with this information rather than just watching and moving on. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered today and actually turn it into a concrete plan. You can start following this week. This video discusses general health and exercise research for informational purposes only and does not constitute personalized medical advice. If you have existing health conditions, balance concerns, or significant physical limitations, consult a qualified physician or physical therapist before attempting the sitting rising test or single leg balance test, particularly if you have concerns about falling. And before beginning any new resistance training program, a sudden or rapid decline in strength or balance should be evaluated by a qualified healthcare provider rather than addressed through self-directed exercise alone, since this can reflect an underlying condition that requires proper medical assessment.